Countenance Part 1. A little girl, no more than 8, stood on the cracked sidewalk clutching a peanut butter sandwich wrapped in tinfoil. Her big eyes locked onto a homeless man slumped against a lamppost, his tattered coat barely keeping out the autumn chill. She'd seen him there before, day after day, always hunched over like the weight of the world pressed him down. Her small hands tightened around the foil, her breath puffing out in the crisp air. Without a word, she marched over, her sneakers scuffing the pavement, and thrust the sandwich into his dirt-streaked hands. His fingers, rough and trembling, brushed hers as he took it. Up close, his face was weathered, his blue eyes sharp despite the grime. He mumbled something, low, gravelly, lost in the wind, and she didn't wait to figure it out. She turned and bolted back home, her heart thumping loud in her chest. The next morning, she was still thinking about those eyes when a sharp knock rattled the front door. She peeked from the kitchen, where she'd been picking at her toast. 2 police officers stood there, their uniforms crisp, their faces hard to read. One was older, with gray at his temples, the other younger, holding a notepad. Her grandfather shuffled to the door, his old slippers dragging on the wood floor. The officers asked about a little girl in a red jacket, her jacket. She stepped forward, clutching the edge of her sweater, wondering what she'd done wrong. The older cop crouched down, his voice calm but serious, and asked about the man. The younger one watched her closely, pen poised. She swallowed hard, her mind racing. All she'd done was give him a sandwich. Why were they here? They left without saying much, just a warning to stay away. But as the door clicked shut, she couldn't shake the feeling that something big was stirring, something tied to that quiet, haunted look in the man's eyes. The day before the police knocked on the door, the little girl sat on a rickety stool by the kitchen window, her chin resting on her hands. Outside, the world was gray and cold, the kind of autumn day that made everything feel heavy. She watched the homeless man again, same as she had for weeks. He was always there, propped against that lamppost-like part of the scenery, his coat so worn it barely clung to his shoulders. She didn't know why he caught her eye, maybe it was the way he sat so still, like he'd given up, or maybe it was how no one else seemed to notice him. She lived in a small house on the edge of town with her grandfather, a gruff old man who smelled of tobacco and old leather. He wasn't much for talking, but he was all she had since her parents were gone, lost to a car wreck she didn't like to think about. That morning, she'd made herself a peanut butter sandwich, the bread a little stale but good enough. Her grandfather sat at the table, sipping black coffee and flipping through a newspaper. That was 2 days old. "Don't waste food," he'd grumbled when she cut the sandwich in half, his voice rough like sandpaper. She didn't argue, she just wrapped the extra piece in tinfoil and stuffed it in her jacket pocket. He didn't ask what she was up to, and she didn't tell him. She wasn't sure why she wanted to give it to the man, only that it felt right, like a tug in her chest she couldn't ignore. After lunch, she slipped outside, the wind biting at her cheeks. The street was quiet, just the rustle of leaves skittering across the pavement. She walked slow at first, her sneakers crunching on gravel, then picked up her pace when she saw him. Up close, he looked worse than from the window, his beard was patchy, his hands cracked and dirty. She stopped a few feet away, her breath catching. What if he yelled at her? What if he didn't want it? But those thoughts melted when his head lifted, and those blue eyes met hers. They weren't angry or mean, just tired, deep, like they'd seen too much. She stepped forward, held out the sandwich, and said, "Here." Her voice came out small, but he heard it. His fingers shook as he took it, brushing hers for a second. "Thanks, kid," he mumbled, his words thick and low, almost lost in the breeze. She nodded, then turned and ran, her heart pounding all the way home. Back inside, she kicked off her shoes and hung her red jacket by the door. Her grandfather glanced up from his paper, his bushy eyebrows knitting together. "You're quiet," he said, not really a question. She shrugged and climbed onto the couch, pulling her knees up. She didn't know how to explain the funny feeling in her stomach, like she'd done something big but didn't understand what. The man's voice stuck with her, rough but soft, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. She wondered if he'd eat the sandwich or just hold it. She wondered who he was, why he was out there alone. Her grandfather coughed, breaking her thoughts, and went back to his reading. The house creaked around them, the old clock ticking on the wall. Everything felt normal, but it wasn't, not quite. That night, she lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the quilt pulled up to her chin. The man's eyes kept floating into her mind, sharp and blue, like they were trying to tell her something. She didn't sleep much, just listened to the wind rattling the windows and her grandfather's snores down the hall. She didn't know why it mattered so much, giving him that sandwich. It was just bread and peanut butter, nothing special. But it felt like more, like she'd stepped into something she couldn't see yet. Downstairs, the floorboards groaned as her grandfather got up for a glass of water, his shadow passing under her door. She closed her eyes, trying to push the man's face away, but it stayed. The next morning, she was picking at her toast when the knock came, sharp, loud, cutting through the quiet. Her grandfather shuffled to the door, muttering under his breath about early visitors. She slid off her chair and peeked around the corner, her stomach flipping when she saw the police. Two of them, standing tall and serious, asking about a little girl in a red jacket. Her grandfather called her over, his voice tighter than usual. She stepped forward, clutching her sweater, her mind racing back to the sandwich, the man, those eyes. What had she started? The knock on the door still echoed in the little girl's ears as she stood in the kitchen, watching her grandfather pull it open. Two police officers filled the doorway, their dark uniforms crisp against the dull morning light. The older one had gray hair peeking out from under his cap, his face lined but kind. The younger one stood straighter, his hand resting on a notepad, his eyes darting around the room. Her grandfather crossed his arms, his flannel shirt wrinkled from sleep. "What's this about?" he asked, his voice low and gravelly, like he was ready for trouble. The older cop stepped forward, his boots creaking on the floor. "We're looking for a little girl, short, brown hair, wearing a red jacket yesterday. That sound like anyone here?" His tone was calm, but there was something behind it, something serious. The girl's stomach twisted. That was her. She edged out from behind the kitchen wall, her sneakers squeaking on the wood. Her grandfather glanced back, his bushy eyebrows pulling together, and waved her over. "Come here," he said, softer than usual. She shuffled to his side, clutching the hem of her sweater, her heart thumping loud enough she thought they'd hear it. The younger cop flipped open his notepad, his pen scratching as he looked her up and down. "You were downtown yesterday, near the old hardware store?" he asked, his voice sharp. She nodded, her throat dry. I saw a man there," she said, barely above a whisper. The older cop crouched down to her level, his knees popping. "The homeless fella, right? You gave him something?" She swallowed hard. "A sandwich. Just peanut butter. I didn't do anything bad." Her voice shook, and she glanced at her grandfather, expecting him to grumble about wasting food again. But his face was tight, his jaw clenched, like he was holding something back. The older cop nodded, his eyes softening a bit. "Nobody's saying you did wrong, kid. We just need to know what happened. Did he say anything to you?" She frowned, trying to remember. "He said thanks, I think. It was quiet. I didn't hear much." The younger cop scribbled faster, his pen loud in the stillness. "Anything else? Did he look upset? Strange?" She shook her head. "He just looked tired. Sad, maybe." The older cop stood up, brushing his hands on his pants. "All right. You see him again, you stay away, okay? Let us handle it." He gave her a small smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Her grandfather shifted, his slippers scuffing the floor. "What's he done? Why were you asking her this?" His voice had an edge now, like he was ready to argue. The younger cop glanced at the older one, like he wasn't sure how much to say. The older cop sighed. "We're just following up on something. Nothing for you to worry about yet." He tipped his hat slightly. "Thanks for your time." They turned to leave, the younger one snapping his notepad shut. The girl watched them go, their boots heavy on the porch steps, until the door clicked shut behind them. Her grandfather locked it, his hands trembling just a little. He turned to her, his eyes hard. "What did you go messing with that man for?" he snapped, but his voice cracked at the end. She flinched. "I just wanted to help." He looked hungry. He rubbed a hand over his face, muttering something about trouble following good deeds. She didn't catch all of it, but it sounded old, worn out, like he'd said it before. He shuffled to the kitchen, leaving her standing there, the air thick with questions she didn't know how to ask. She climbed onto the couch, pulling her knees up, replaying the visit in her head. Why did the police care about a sandwich? Was the man in trouble? Had she gotten him in trouble? Those blue eyes flashed in her mind again, sharp and deep, like they were hiding something big. She didn't understand, but she felt it, like a thread pulling tight between her and him, something she couldn't shake loose. Her grandfather came back with his coffee, slumping into his chair. He didn't look at her, just stared at the wall, his fingers tapping the mug. "Stay out of it," he said finally, quiet but firm. "You hear me?" She nodded, but her mind was already spinning. The police hadn't told her much, but they'd asked too many questions for it to be nothing. And her grandfather, he knew something, she could tell. The way his hand shook, the way he wouldn't meet her eyes. She hugged her knees tighter, the house creaking around them. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and she wondered if the man was still out there, sitting against that lamppost, the sandwich long gone. Whatever she'd started, it wasn't over, not yet. The little girl couldn't sleep that night after the police left. She lay in her narrow bed, the quilt bunched up around her, staring at the shadows dancing on the ceiling. The wind howled outside, sneaking through the cracks in the old house, and every creak made her jump. Those blue eyes, the homeless man's eyes, kept floating into her mind. They weren't just tired or sad like she'd told the cops. They were sharp, like they'd seen her before, like they knew something she didn't. She turned onto her side, pulling the blanket tighter, but the questions wouldn't let her rest. Why had the police come? What was so important about a sandwich? Downstairs, the clock ticked on, slow and steady. But it felt louder than usual. She thought about her grandfather, too, how his hands had shaken when he locked the door, how he'd snapped at her but then gone quiet. He wasn't the yelling type, not really. He'd always been gruff but steady, like the oak tree out back that never swayed, even in a storm. But today, he'd looked rattled, and that scared her more than the police. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to push it all away, but the man's mumbled thanks echoed in her ears, low and rough, like a secret she wasn't meant to hear. The next morning, she dragged herself to the kitchen, her socks sliding on the cold floor. Her grandfather was already up, hunched over the table with his coffee. The radio hummed in the background, an old thing with dials that barely worked. She climbed onto her stool, picking at a piece of toast, when the news crackled through. The announcer's voice was tinny but clear. A local man, missing for years, was spotted downtown yesterday near the old hardware store. Police are asking for information. Her heart skipped. She dropped her toast, crumbs scattering across the table. The description fit: tattered coat, scruffy beard. Her grandfather's head snapped up, his mug clunking down hard. "Turn that off," he growled, reaching for the dial. But she'd heard enough. "Was that him?" she asked, her voice small. He didn't answer, just stared at the radio like it had betrayed him. His silence said more than words could. She watched him, the lines on his face deeper than usual, his fingers tapping the table. "Grandpa, do you know him?" she pressed, leaning forward. He shot her a look, sharp, almost angry, then softened. "Eat your breakfast," he muttered, pushing his chair back and shuffling to the sink. She didn't move, her mind racing. Missing for years? Spotted yesterday? It had to be the man. And if it was, why did her grandfather act like he'd seen a ghost? The day dragged on, gray and heavy outside. She stayed inside, restless, flipping through an old comic book she'd read a dozen times. Her grandfather kept busy, chopping wood out back, fixing a loose hinge on the door, anything to avoid her eyes. But she couldn't let it go. Those police questions, the news report, her grandfather's shaky hands, it all fit together somehow, and she needed to know. By afternoon, she'd made up her mind. She pulled on her red jacket, the one the cops had asked about, and slipped out while her grandfather napped in his chair, the TV droning low. The walk downtown wasn't far, just a few blocks past the gas station and the empty lot where kids rode bikes. Her sneakers crunched on fallen leaves, her breath puffing out in little clouds. She didn't know what she'd say if she saw the man again, but she had to look. When she reached the hardware store, her heart sank, the lamppost was empty. No tattered coat, no slumped figure. She bit her lip, scanning the street. Then she saw him. Farther down, sitting on a bench with a paper cup in his hands. He looked different, cleaner, his beard trimmed, but those blue eyes were unmistakable. She ducked behind a tree, her pulse racing. He wasn't alone. A woman with gray hair and a limp walked up, her coat buttoned tight against the wind. She stopped in front of him, her hands trembling, and then she started crying, big, messy tears. The man stood, slow and stiff, and she threw her arms around him. The girl couldn't hear what they said, but she saw his shoulders shake, like he was crying too. She pressed herself against the tree, her mind spinning. Who was that woman? Why were they hugging? She ran home, her sneakers pounding the pavement, her chest tight with something she couldn't name. Bursting through the door, she found her grandfather awake, his eyes narrowing as she panted in the doorway. "Where'd you go?" he demanded. "I saw him," she blurted. The man. He was with a lady, and they were crying. Her grandfather's face went pale, his coffee mug slipping from his hand to the table. He sat down hard, like his legs couldn't hold him. "You don't listen, do you?" he said, but his voice was weak. She stepped closer. "Grandpa, who is he?" He looked at her, his eyes cloudy, and after a long pause, he whispered, "Someone I couldn't save." The little girl stood in the doorway, her chest heaving from the run home, her red jacket unzipped and flapping. Her grandfather sat at the kitchen table, his face white as a sheet, staring at the coffee mug he'd nearly dropped. "Someone I couldn't save," he'd said, his voice so quiet she almost missed it. The words hung heavy in the air, like smoke that wouldn't clear. She stepped closer, her sneakers squeaking on the floor, her eyes wide. "What do you mean, Grandpa?" she asked, her voice trembling. He didn't answer right away, just rubbed his hands over his face, slow and tired, like he was trying to wipe away something old and painful. She pulled out a chair and sat across from him, her small hands gripping the edge of the table. The house was quiet except for the hum of the fridge and the faint drip of the sink. Her grandfather looked at her then, really looked at her, his eyes cloudy with something she didn't understand, guilt, maybe, or regret. "You shouldn't have gone down there," he said, but there was no fight in it. She bit her lip. "I had to. The police, the radio. I knew it was him." "Who is he?" He sighed, a long, shaky breath, and leaned back in his chair. "He's an old friend," he said finally. "From the war." Her mouth dropped open a little. The war. Her grandfather never talked about that, not the fighting, not the medals he kept in a box under his bed, not the scars on his arm he said were from a long time ago. She'd seen him stare out the window sometimes, lost in thoughts he never shared, but this was different. "What happened?" she asked, leaning forward. He tapped his fingers on the table, slow and uneven, like he was counting the years. "We were in the same unit, me and him. Best pals, thick as thieves. He saved my life once, pulled me out of a ditch when the shells were flying. I owed him everything." She watched him, her heart thumping. "Then why's he out there? Why's he alone?" Her grandfather's face crumpled, just for a second, before he caught himself. "After we came home, things went bad for him. The war, it sticks with you. He couldn't sleep, couldn't work. Started drinking, drifting. I tried to help, brought him food, gave him a place to crash, but he kept running off. Said he didn't want to drag me down. Last I heard, he'd disappeared. That was years ago. His voice cracked, and he looked away, out the window where the sky was turning dark. The girl sat back, her mind spinning. The man with the blue eyes, the one she'd given the sandwich to, was her grandfather's friend? She pictured him on that bench, the gray-haired woman hugging him, tears everywhere. The lady I saw, was that his sister? She asked. Her grandfather nodded, slow and heavy. Sounds like it. She never gave up looking for him. Used to call me, asking if I'd seen him. I hadn't, not till you started talking about that fella by the lamppost. He shook his head. Should have known it was him. She frowned, piecing it together. But why didn't you go to him? If you knew, he cut her off, his voice sharp. Because I failed him, all right? I stopped trying. Thought he was gone for good, and I let him go. He slammed a hand on the table, softer than he meant to, and the mug rattled. She flinched but didn't look away. His eyes were wet now, shining in the dim light. I didn't save him back then, and I didn't save him after. You did more with that sandwich than I ever did. Her chest tightened. She hadn't known, how could she? All she'd done was hand over some peanut butter and bread because he looked hungry. But now it felt bigger, like she'd pulled on a thread that unraveled something huge. He's not alone anymore, she said quietly. That lady, his sister, she found him. Her grandfather nodded, swallowing hard. Maybe he's got a chance now. He stood up, slow and stiff, and shuffled to the sink, his back to her. Go wash up, he mumbled. Enough for today. But it wasn't enough, not for her. She sat there, staring at the table, her mind racing. The man wasn't just a stranger anymore. He was part of her grandfather's story, part of the quiet pain he carried. And she'd stepped right into it without even knowing. She thought about those blue eyes again, how they'd looked at her when she handed him the sandwich, grateful, but heavy, like he was carrying a lifetime of hurt. She didn't understand it all, not yet, but she felt it deep in her bones, something was changing, and she was part of it. That night, she lay in bed again, the wind quieter now. The house still. Her grandfather's words echoed, someone I couldn't save. She wondered if he'd sleep better knowing his friend wasn't lost anymore. She wondered if the man would remember her, the girl with the sandwich. And she wondered what would happen next, because whatever this was, it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The little girl woke up the next morning with a knot in her stomach, the kind that wouldn't go away no matter how much she tried to ignore it. Her grandfather's words from last night, someone I couldn't save, stuck with her, heavy and real. She found him in the kitchen, already dressed in his old flannel coat, his hands wrapped around a mug of coffee that had gone cold. He didn't look at her when she came in, just stared at the table like it held all the answers. Get your jacket, he said finally, his voice rough but steady. We're going downtown. Her eyes widened. To see him? She asked, barely breathing. He nodded, slow and firm. Time I faced it. You're coming too. She didn't argue, didn't want to. She grabbed her red jacket, the one that started all this, and followed him out the door. The air was crisp, the sky a pale gray, and the crunch of leaves under their feet was the only sound as they walked. Her grandfather moved slower than usual, his shoulders hunched, like he was carrying more than just his old bones. The trip downtown felt longer than it should have, every step heavy with something unspoken. When they reached the diner near the hardware store, she spotted him through the window, the man with the blue eyes. He sat in a booth, a cup of coffee in front of him, looking cleaner than before. His coat was still tattered, but his face was shaved, his hair combed back. The gray-haired woman sat across from him, her hands folded tight, a small smile on her lips. The girl's heart thumped. Her grandfather stopped outside the door, his hand on the handle, and for a second, she thought he'd turn back. But he took a deep breath and pushed it open. The bell above the door jingled, and the man looked up. Those blue eyes locked onto her grandfather, and time seemed to freeze. The woman turned too, her smile fading into something softer, sadder. The girl stayed close to her grandfather, her sneakers scuffing the linoleum floor as they walked over. "Hey," her grandfather said, his voice cracking. The man blinked, slow, like he wasn't sure it was real. "You," he rasped, his tone rough but warm. "Been a long time." Her grandfather nodded, swallowing hard. "Too long." They slid into the booth, the girl next to her grandfather, the air thick with years of silence. The woman reached out, touching the man's hand. "This is my sister," he said, nodding at her. "She tracked me down." The woman's eyes were wet, but she smiled. "Couldn't let him go," she said softly. The girl watched, her hands fidgeting in her lap. Then the man looked at her. Those blue eyes sharp and clear. "You're the kid with the sandwich," he said, a faint grin tugging at his lips. She nodded, shy. "Yeah. You looked hungry." He chuckled, a low, rusty sound. "That sandwich, it woke me up. Made me think maybe I wasn't done yet." Her grandfather shifted, his hands clenching on the table. "I should have been there," he muttered. "After the war, I should have fought harder for you." The man shook his head. "You did what you could. I was the one who ran." His voice was quiet, but it carried weight, like he'd been holding those words for years. The girl saw her grandfather's eyes glisten, and he looked away, blinking fast. The woman leaned forward. "He's coming home with me," she said. "Got a spare room, a job lined up at the garage." "It's a start." The man nodded, sipping his coffee. She wouldn't take no for an answer. Her grandfather managed a small smile. "Good. You deserve it." The girl listened, her chest loosening a little. She'd seen him alone, broken, against that lamppost, and now he wasn't. It felt big, bigger than she could say. They talked for a while, slow, halting words about old days, battles they'd survived, promises they'd broken. The girl stayed quiet, soaking it in. Her grandfather's voice softened as he spoke, like a weight was lifting. The man told her how her sandwich had been the first thing he'd eaten in days, how it made him call his sister after years of nothing. "You're a tough one, kid," he said, and she grinned, her cheeks warm. Her grandfather put a hand on her shoulder, rough but gentle. "She gets that from her mom," he said, his voice thick. When they stood to leave, the man grabbed her grandfather's arm. "Don't disappear again," he said, firm. Her grandfather nodded. "I won't." Outside, the girl walked beside him, the cold air sharp on her face. He didn't say much, but his steps were lighter, his shoulders straighter. "You did good," he said finally, glancing down at her. She smiled, small but real. She hadn't known what that sandwich would do, hadn't known it would pull her grandfather out of his guilt or give a lost man a way back. But it had, and that was enough. Weeks passed after that day in the diner, and the little girl noticed a change in the air around the house. It wasn't just the weather turning colder, the leaves all gone from the trees, it was her grandfather. He didn't shuffle as much, didn't sit staring out the window with that faraway look. He'd started whistling again, old tunes she hadn't heard since she was tiny, back when her parents were still around. She liked it, even if it was off-key sometimes. The man with the blue eyes wasn't at the lamppost anymore, and that felt right too, like a piece of the world had clicked back into place. One Saturday, her grandfather knocked on her bedroom door, his coat already on. "Get dressed," he said, a spark in his voice she hadn't heard in ages. "We're going visiting." She tugged on her red jacket, her stomach fluttering with excitement. They drove across town in his old truck, the engine rattling like it might give up any second. When they pulled up to a small house with peeling paint and a tidy yard, she saw the man step out onto the porch. He looked different, his coat was new, a plain brown one, and his face was fuller, less hollow. The gray-haired woman, his sister, waved from the doorway, a dish towel in her hands. They sat in the living room, a cozy space with a lumpy couch and a wood stove crackling in the corner. The man offered her grandfather a coffee, and they took it black, just like old times, he said with a grin. The girl perched on a chair, sipping a glass of milk, listening as they talked. It wasn't the stiff, heavy talk from the diner, this was easier, full of chuckles and stories about muddy boots and army pranks. The sister chimed in, teasing them both, her laugh warm and bright. The girl smiled, her chest swelling. She'd never seen her grandfather like this, alive, not just getting by. The man caught her eye and leaned forward. Got a job now, he said, proud. Fixing cars down at the garage. Ain't much, but it's something. She nodded, remembering how he'd looked against that lamppost, like he'd given up. You're good at it, she asked. He laughed, a rough, happy sound. Used to be. Hand still remember, even if the rest of me's rusty. Her grandfather clapped him on the shoulder. Better than me. I'd break more than I'd fix. They all laughed, and the girl felt it deep down, this was what she'd started, even if she hadn't meant to. Later, the sister brought out a plate of cookies, still warm from the oven. He told me about your sandwich, she said to the girl, her eyes soft. Said it was the push he needed to call me. The girl blushed, picking at a cookie. It was just peanut butter, she mumbled. The woman shook her head. It was more than that. You gave him a reason to try again. The man nodded, his blue eyes steady on her. She's right, kid. I'd been hiding out there, thinking nobody cared. That sandwich, it was like a light flicking on. Her grandfather set his mug down, his voice quiet. I should have been the one to do it. Should have dragged you back years ago. The man waved him off. You're here now. That's what counts. The girl watched them, her throat tight. She hadn't known her grandfather carried that guilt, or that the man had been so lost. But she'd seen it, the way her small act rippled out, pulling them all together. The police had been part of it too, she learned later. They'd been looking for him, not because he'd done wrong, but because his sister had begged them to find him, filing reports every year he was missing. As the sun dipped low, they said their goodbyes. The man hugged her grandfather, a quick, hard squeeze, and then turned to her. Keep being you, kid, he said, ruffling her hair. She grinned, her cheeks warm. Back in the truck, her grandfather was quiet, but it wasn't the heavy silence she was used to. You proud of me? She asked, glancing at him. He smiled, small but real. More than you know, he said, his voice thick. You did what I couldn't. That night, she lay in bed, the house creaking around her, and thought about it all. A sandwich, just bread and peanut butter, had brought a man off the streets, mended her grandfather's broken past, and given a sister her brother back. It wasn't magic or luck, it was kindness, small and simple, but strong enough to change everything. She closed her eyes, the lesson settling deep. You never know how far a little good can go, how it can heal wounds you can't even see. And that, she decided, was worth living for.